Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast, where we share the best practices we use to help our residential real estate investor clients automate their rent collection and get on with their lives. Check out the show notes at www.landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. This show is brought to you by Roost Real Estate Co. Property Management. To learn more about our company and the services we provide, visit www.managewithroost.com. Now, here's your host, Chris McAllister.
Welcome to what is really our first episode of the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast. We did release an initial episode that was our recording of my book, the Landlord Profitability Playbook, as our first episode, but this is the first real episode with new content and a new conversation with my good friend and podcast partner, Laci LeBlanc. So Laci and I have been working together to get everything out of my head about the Landlord Profitability Playbook and get it out into the world. And she's also here to keep me on track during this podcast today. So Laci, thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, Chris. As you know, my family has been in the real estate business, both as agents and investors, since before I was born. So it's all really fascinating to me. Just happy to hear your expert take on it. What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to talk about neighborhood standards. So we're going to be discussing ways to ensure that our listeners' properties maintain or live up to, but more importantly, don't surpass the standard of the neighborhood that they reside in. So that's what this one's all about today.
That's a great topic. I think, especially right now, I think about how the price of literally everything is going up so rapidly. And in real estate investing, I feel like that's particularly tricky because costs are going up for investors and for the renters that they want in their properties. So finding a balance that covers your costs as an investor and makes you a little money each month, but also doesn't overextend a good renter in your area has to be pretty difficult, I imagine.
Yeah, so I always coach our property managers and clients that when they buy a property, you get all excited, you get caught up in the moment and you want to really create something that you're proud of, right? But what you want to be conscious of is wherever you buy the property, what are the standards of the neighborhood? And how can, I want to say live up to them, but not go crazy either. So the term neighborhood standards encompasses, like you said, a lot of different elements of ownership. It comes from, first of all, how much did you pay for the house? How much our house is selling for in that neighborhood? Did you get a great deal and underpay, or did you not get such a great deal, and overpay? And then the other issue is, how much money do you put into rehabbing the house, and how much money is that house going to cost you to maintain, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So you got to make sure that the property, make sure it keeps up.
Yeah. Do you have some examples of, neighborhood standards? And it's kind of I don't know, it's not a term you can find in Webster's dictionary. So just some examples of what we're looking for as investors on what commonly you need to know about neighborhood standards.
Well, let's start with the very beginning. So, I always urge all of our listeners and any client that we deal with, we have a lot of property management clients that work with other real estate professionals to buy properties. And we have many that work with us to buy and we manage for them. But the first thing is you've got to have a partnership with your realtor, with your real estate professional. And they have to be very clear on not just your goals, but what your strategy is for creating a real estate portfolio. So if you've decided that there's a certain type of house or a certain neighborhood that you want to focus on because it's your sweet spot that works for what you need in your portfolio, that's great. Just make sure that your realtor understands it as well. And your realtor can always give you, comparable sales for the properties, right? So, if you've got a neighborhood that, the houses generally cost $150,000, that you can rent that out or you hope that you can rent that out for, $1,500 a month. That's great, right? So, but obviously, if the houses sell on that street or in that neighborhood for $150,000, the last thing that you want to do is to pay more than $150,000 for that house because you're immediately outside the standard. but you've also got to think through, it's not just what the house, retails for, it's how much you have in the property all in after getting it ready to rent again. So obviously, if you find a house, it's 150,000, it's move-in ready, fantastic. You've hit your numbers, no question asked. But if you happen to find a house that's, I don't really care what it's listed at, but let's say it's listed for 150,000, but it's going to require $40,000 out of pocket to get it rent ready and get it to the neighborhood standard, then obviously the most that you can spend on that property to purchase it is 110,000, right? Because you can't have more than 150,000 in. So the neighborhood standard just isn't about the list price or how much you can close the house for. The neighborhood standard is about your all-in investment on the street or in the neighborhood. So if you don't have access to those kind of comparables, then you want your real estate partner, your realtor, to be able to get that information for you. So that's the first step. That's critical.
Yeah, part one of three-ish, it sounds like, is just for investors to purchase the property. And, to my untrained eye, the market is crazy, seems crazy right now. Interest rates alone are a nightmare. So it sounds like research and partnering with somebody who can help you with that is key. I mean, research is, I guess it's easy to do, but it's easier not to do. It somehow always falls to the bottom of the list, like leaving you scrambling at the last minute. And I feel like, investors could use this as almost like a checklist of what they should be looking at prior to investing in a particular neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. And, again, when it comes to price, you got to research, like you said, you got to understand the price range of the properties in the neighborhood before you dive in. You've got to compare the property's price with similar properties in the area so you don't overpay. And that's where you get into, if all the other houses in the neighborhood are 4 bedrooms and this one happens to be 2 bedrooms, that's an issue. You've got to know that up front. If you find out that all the other houses had a bath and a half and yours only has a bath, but it doesn't necessarily work conversely, right? The last thing you want to do is to pay, 150,000 for a house when the house isn't exactly like the ones that have been selling for 150,000, because the rental math doesn't work both ways, right? So if the average house in the neighborhood is 150,000 and it rents for 1,500 and has 4 bedrooms and 2 baths, and the house you bought, only has 2 bedrooms and 1 bath, no matter how much you want it, you are not going to rent that house for anywhere near the same price that the other houses in the neighborhood has. Now, I know that sounds obvious and duh, but here's the thing though that people forget. Let's say that the standard in the neighborhood is 4 bedroom and you've got a house with 6 bedrooms and 2.5 baths. Don't expect that you're going to rent that house for $1,700, $1,800, $1,900 just because it's got a couple of extra bedrooms. If that's not what the neighborhood standard is, your market for people who are going to be willing to pay more because that house has additional square footage, that's not a big group to choose from. So what you tend to find yourself is, if you don't buy the standard, you're going to get, if the house you buy isn't up to the standard, you can expect to take less rent. But if the house you buy is ahead of the standard, you cannot expect to get a commensurate extra amount of rent to justify your purchase. So, we really urge you to keep that in mind. And again, that's where your partnership with your realtor is going to come in very handy.
Yeah, I think that's, in my opinion, the kind of the most riveting part of this conversation we're going to have today. Why is it important to avoid renting a property, trying to rent a property for more than the neighborhood standard? And I like this question because it deals directly with profit. It's numbers. You can justify just about anything when you're talking about buying a property maybe for a little too much, and I've heard it all from Nana and my parents. And my Nana is an agent and she owns several renter properties, but what you can't argue with are the numbers. So when you talk about, if I start talking about profit and numbers, it's always how I make my point when I'm discussing my family's business with them as a marketer and a business person. So I know ears will perk up here when we start to talk about, avoiding trying to rent a property for more than the neighborhood standard.
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you how many investors that and I'm one of them. I'd like to think I'm better now, but when I first got started, I was guilty of just the most
rehabilitated.
but I was guilty of just the most incredible magical thinking that, I was going to buy this house and I'm a nice guy and I'm going to treat everybody well and I'm going to fix it up, so nicely, and everybody's going to be coming out of the woodwork to pay me money and pay me extra money. And, it's all just going to be sweetness and niceness and, this great utopia. And it just doesn't happen that way. So just as important as, not overpaying for a house relative to the neighborhood standards, you've got to make sure that the house you purchase or the house that you rehab that the numbers work in such a way that you are going to be cash flow positive and get a suitable return on your investment. But the only way that you can calculate that is to look at the numbers. So, your realtor can help you find rental rates, in the area. Your property manager certainly can give you input on what rental rates are in the neighborhood. You can, of course, check the internet, apartments.com, whatever you want to look at. But please don't do what I did, when I first started out. Don't kid yourself. The numbers are the numbers. And, I don't care if somebody tells you that they're getting, way above and beyond what somebody else is getting. If they're telling the truth, I can't guarantee anything, but I'm going to say it. I guarantee you that they did not collect rent for the full year. It's easy to find somebody with cash burning a hole in their pocket and give a landlord, first month's in the security deposit. But if that rent is outside of the standard, it just simply will not last. So, I don't want to harp on this, but it's so critical, and I see it happen so many times. So if you're going to try to charge excessively high rent compared to the neighborhood standard, you are not going to have the number of qualified applicants that you need to have to find a tenant that not only is going to pay the rent every month for the next 12 months, but is going to leave that property in at least as good and hopefully better condition than when they found it. So you've got to hit that rent sweet spot that's at the standard, for the neighborhood. And let's face it, prospective renters, especially ones that do well managing their money, they've got all the information that we have, right? They know what the neighborhood standard is. They know how much rent is supposed to be. I mean, they're savvy, and probably more savvy than they used to be. And anybody that is going to be willing to pay above and beyond that, you should be suspect, because there's probably a good chance that, something in their background or history or income or employment is going to make it less likely that they're going to, successfully complete the lease terms. So setting the price within the standard range increases the likelihood that you're going to attract, I guess, what I like to call perfect fit tenants that are going to live up to the terms of the lease and minimize vacancies down the road.
Yeah, I think when we've talked about this in the past, you talk about how it's about what the market demands. And again, that goes back to just the numbers. And as a marketer, that really resonates with me, because it's the same conversation, whether we're talking about a smartphone app for $1.99 that's targeted to my kids and my bank account in the end, or a $75,000 luxury car, or a $500,000 real estate investment. So knowing who your target market is, who's going to live in that neighborhood, what the market will bear, what the neighborhood standard is, and then this is going to lead me to an obvious next question, but how to get the most out of what you're offering is just a paramount conversation when it comes to marketing anything, really. So talk to me about why investors should avoid falling below the neighborhood standard when rehabbing a property.
Well, the most critical thing is, of course, that we want to be offering properties as owners and as property managers that are, I guess, for lack of a better term, safe and secure, right? I don't care what the property is, for whether it's a $500 a month property or a $2,500 a month property. The property has to work, right? The plumbing has to work, the electric has to work, the roof has to be secure. It's just absolutely paramount that the property is safe and secure. So even if safe and secure is above the neighborhood standard you're looking at, I guess that's the one case that I'm going to break the rule, right? But if that's something that you want to invest in, safety and security, it's just a basic human need. It's what you owe your tenants. And quite frankly, as a property management company, we don't work with owners who don't follow that logic. So basics come first. Now, having said that, if every other house in the neighborhood, let's just use the bathroom, has a bath and a half, and yours has a single bath, it's not going to be a complete deal breaker, but you're not quite to the neighborhood standard. The other direction, Laci, is actually easier to talk about and make the point. And it's something that, I did wrong at the beginning again. So let's say that you get caught up in the moment, you buy this house, you're all excited, you're going to make it beautiful, it's fun to decorate, pick out paint colors, whatever. And, you say to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm just going to make this the best. Everybody's going to want to rent it. And you do some silly things like you put a dishwasher in. Now, a dishwasher sounds like a pretty basic thing, but it's not, right? There are many neighborhoods where kitchens don't have dishwashers. Or take the next extreme, you're going to put in a jacuzzi tub because, jacuzzi
a
tubs
bidet, you add a
bidet, right? Because you want one. So you're going to put one in your rental property. So to spend that money to go above and beyond the neighborhood standard because it feels good to you is going to be, money that you're flushing down the drain. There is no tenant that is going to be excited about paying you an extra $50, $100, $200 a month because, there's a brand new dishwasher, a jacuzzi cup, and a bidet in that house if that's not what the neighborhood standard is. Now, if you're in a neighborhood where that is the standard and you don't have those things, you're going to have a problem. But, for most 90% of the folks that we work with, you've got to stay within the standard. And any money you spend above and beyond the standard for, I guess, what I would call, what at the end of the day are frivolous items, it's just quite simply going to be money down the drain.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, and this is hard for me to hear, but this is not the time to be an overachiever or an underachiever, really. This really is the time to just kind of toe the line and maintain the status quo and really, make it timeless, make it work, and let it be after that. So what are the areas, like the key areas that investors should focus on, when we're talking about meeting neighborhood standards? We talked about, safe and secure, obviously. I'm guessing there are some areas of a home that, it's more important that it be, newer or nicer, or I don't know. What are the areas that investors should focus on, and how do you meet the neighborhood standards in those areas without going too far one way or the other?
Well, again, I think you have to start with the basics. You got to make sure the plumbing, the electricity is working, it's all safe, that the house is structurally sound, right? That the porch isn't falling off the front of the house, there's no water damage and so forth. The other thing that you have, that again, it sounds terrible, but that I feel strongly about is the first thing is you've got to catch up on any deferred maintenance, right? If, it could be as simple as the gutters not getting cleaned out because, right, if the gutters are clogged over time, you're going to have basement problems. You're going to have foundation issues. If, in Ohio, we've got a lot of older houses with these great front porches, and I can't tell you how many front porches are in disrepair, just because of the weather and the rain and the hot and the cold over the years and years. So any deferred maintenance has to be dealt with first. Safety, deferred maintenance, absolutely critical. If you haven't done those things, and if not doing those things takes you below the neighborhood standard, you are not going to make money on this property. And the sad part is, if you are in a neighborhood where that's not the standard, God, you're kind of on your own because we can't work with you. But I would say,
yeah, that's a really good point. That's a good point. Like, well, lipstick on a pig, right? If you're
it is, but everything also comes back to what did you pay for it, right? And if the max is 150,000 and you've got 50,000 or 40,000, whatever it is to put in it, then make sure you buy it right so that there's enough room and to get that property back to where it needs to be, right? So I can't stress that strongly enough. It's, there's so little inventory on the market right now that I think people are, overpaying for properties in hopes that, they're going to make it up over time. But the reality is, if the property in that neighborhood is 150,000, you've got to put 50 in it just to make it standard, then you cannot be paying, more.
The math doesn't math. The math isn't mathing.
The math doesn't math. That's exactly right. And the other thing you got to keep in mind is, what kind of house are you buying, right? And what is it going to cost to maintain? paint it. So let's say it's as simple as, is this house already have aluminum siding, or is this house, painted clapboard, right? With aluminum siding, the house is probably going to last, quote, longer without major repairs, although, there's many times that people have to paint siding. But if you have a house that is painted and it's already peeling or faded or chipping or on the way to, disintegration, you've got to take that into account as well. So, and again, I feel like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. But so let's say that you've got enough room to get that house to the neighborhood standard. You get a great tenant in there. They work out their lease for a year or two, what have you. You put some money aside. Then it becomes appropriate to do some things to that property because you're going to hold on to it. So maybe it is, you're going to put vinyl siding on the property, right? Because if you make that investment in vinyl siding on the property, that property is going to serve you far better and more economically, forever, right? You got to have a good roof. But, there's times when I've seen landlords just continue to spend hundreds of dollars fixing a roof. And maybe it's because they don't have the capital to replace the roof. But there comes a point where the repair costs are more than, putting a new roof on. It's almost like, having a used car that's paid for and it feels great and you keep fixing it. And then finally you get to the point where you realize, my God, I just need to buy a new car. So there is some talking out of both sides of your mouth, right? You got to stay to the neighborhood standard. But if you bought the right house, you've got income, you can rent it, and it's time to improve it for the long term, then it's time to do that. And maybe it is a higher efficiency furnace. Maybe depending on the neighborhood, it's air conditioning. It probably is vinyl siding. I think I said aluminum earlier, but that just shows my age. But vinyl siding, a roof, and so forth. And one other tip on that, there's things that you can do to the interior of the house too that maybe in the moment could exceed the neighborhood standard, but in the calculation of holding on to that house for the long term makes sense. So, I've had houses and we've had owners that just every other tenant, they're changing out cheap carpet, right? And that might be $500 to do cheap carpet, and maybe it costs $1,000 to do laminated flooring. Well, there does come a point where when you're in this game for the long term, that making the investment, a flooring product that is going to, hold up for the next 10, 12, 15 years is the right decision, even if in the short term, suddenly you do have the nicest house in the neighborhood. But at that point, you're doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your family, you're doing it for your financial future.
Yeah, this conversation sounds very familiar, probably because we just did a rehab and maintenance guide, right? Which just reiterates how important the whole cost-effective rehabbing and maintenance of a property is for you, the investor, for the tenant, for maintaining neighborhood standards. It also reminds me about how important it is, and this is something that like my family struggles with, being a family business. My family has always kind of relied on whoever's working, my brother, my dad, my uncle, my grandfather, my grandmother, to maintain the property. So they'll go in and make the fixes, or they'll call the AC guy or whatever the case may be, but they don't have a great property management team that is dedicated to either, in-house or outsourced, that's dedicated to keeping a property up and kind of maintaining it. And that's been a real headache for them. So I think that's another good point when you're talking about neighborhood standards, is just having a system in place, whether you do it in-house or you outsource it to a property management company, to make sure that you're incrementally making these, you're maintaining it and you're rehabbing and you're adjusting and you're upgrading as you can, so that you don't end up, with a long-term tenant, which is everybody's goal, right? A good long-term tenant that pays their rent and keeps the property up and leaves it better than they found it. But if they're there for 10 years, then if you haven't kept up with things, then you got a lot of work to do before you can rent that property out again. So that's just another fair point.
True. I think. We've had that situation many times where I think you become complacent, right? You've got somebody who's in the property for years and years. They continue to pay the rent. They don't ask for anything, and out of sight, out of mind. And then suddenly, they're gone after 10 years, and you've got a giant renovation on your hands. Now, if you actually kept your reserves in place for that 10 years, you'd probably, in a perfect world, you'd have a nice chunk of change to do that renovation with.
Well, and if you raised your rate with the market, which a lot of people also don't do, right? A long-term tenant, 10 years ago, they were paying $475 and it's 2023 and they're still paying $475, right. And you're just paying your property taxes, really.
Exactly. And, that's why property management is so all encompassing. And most of us don't have all those skills, ourselves. But you're right. A long-term tenant, the rent should go up, incrementally. It doesn't have to go up crazy. It just goes up incrementally. And it's easy to have a tenant become, out of sight, out of mind, but you could end up with a giant bill on your hands, when that person leaves. So what would you do? In a perfect world, having interaction with the tenant on an annual basis, doing an inspection on the property on an annual basis, negotiating the new rent with the tenant. And, it's always a great conversation to have, to check with the tenant. Hey, we're coming up on the end of the lease. We hope you're going to stay. We want to, hopefully improve the property, make sure that you're happy and we're happy. Can we take a quick look? And sometimes, you can keep a tenant for years and years just by, checking in with them, even once a year. And maybe, you've got to raise the rent $50 because that's where the market's at. But that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be thrilled with the fact that you're going to install a new ceiling fan for them because the old one is all wiggly and raggedy and all that stuff, right? So there are things that, you have to do to protect yourself, even with a long-term tenant. What a fabulous opportunity. What a great relationship. But that doesn't mean it's not a business. It doesn't mean that the rent doesn't go up. It doesn't mean that you don't make incremental improvements. And better you maintain the property over that 10-year period than wake up 10 years later without a tenant and a giant bill on your hands.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so much psychology that goes into this. And, tenants, I know there are tenants out there who, if something breaks that's minor, they're happy to live with it, as opposed to saying, hey, this broke, it needs fixing. It's a light switch or a ceiling fan, but because they don't want their rent to be raised, right? They don't want They don't want people to come in and raise their rent because they had to do work because
and sometimes they just don't want to be bothered, and they deserve that too. But you still have a business to run and you've got an asset to protect. You mentioned something too that's interesting. When I talk about, I know it sounds really arbitrary that, if it's going to cost $40,000 retail, to fix a property to the neighborhood standard, that doesn't take into account that we have a lot of owners that we work with that either have construction companies or, are handy or retired, and they love doing that work. Right. So, and that's everybody has gifts, advantages, capabilities, whatever. And, if you are somebody who is handy and can do things, and if not just manage the construction of the rehab or actually do a lot of the work, obviously you're going to save a tremendous amount of money. And if it's a house that really makes sense for your portfolio and, you can pay 125 for it, that maybe I can only pay 110 for it. That's an advantage that you should exercise as long as you're willing to go in and do that work yourself. So we do have quite a few owners like that. On the other hand, we have quite a few owners that, have full-time jobs, professions, dentists, lawyers, whatever. They are into real estate investing to, diversify their overall financial portfolio, and they want a more hands-off approach. And they know that they're going to have to pay more than somebody else might, and they're okay with it. There's no right or wrong way, but you want your property manager to understand, what your personal advantages are and help you leverage them, just like you want your realtor who's helping you purchase properties level your, personal advantages and help you leverage them.
Yeah, that all makes sense. We've covered so much on this topic. I think, neighborhood standard is just kind of an all-encompassing, it's like a jumping off point for all things real estate investing, it seems like. But above all, what I'm hearing is there are so many variables. You have to know your market. You have to know, your sweet spot, and you have to be willing to make the hard decisions to make sure you're in that sweet spot. Does that pretty much sum it up?
It does. You've got to know the market you're in. You've got to know the tenants who live in that market. You've got to know what your personal capabilities are. You've got to know, you've got to be informed, and, you can't, abdicate that responsibility to anybody, but you do need partners around you that understand that knowledge is power, and to not have that knowledge or to act in the face of it is going to cost you money. What else I wanted to say today? I'm going through my notes real quick as we wrap up here, but again, I guess, Laci, just to sum up, please, as an investor, don't sink your cash into unnecessary updates and amenities, because you're not going to get paid back for it. Make sure that you're taking care of the tenants, that you're giving them a safe place to live, and that it's a fair price, and that it works for both of you, right? You can't be renting your properties out at a price that doesn't allow you a suitable return on investment, or maximum investment that you could possibly get. You're a capitalist, you're a business person, you deserve that. But the only way that works, and the only way you get to enjoy that, is if your tenant that's renting the property gets what they need out of the property as well.
Yeah, I think these are words that almost everybody in this industry need to hear. I personally, when this episode comes out, I'm gonna anonymously email it to my entire family. So with your contact information for any question that they may have.
Well, I guess to wrap up, I would really urge everybody, if you haven't already downloaded the Landlord Profitability Playbook, I would love for you to do that and take a look. And you can do that at www.profitabilityplaybook.com. If you're new to the investment game, or if you've been at it for a while, I think you may find some helpful tips and ideas in there to help you take your residential real estate investment business to the next level. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to check us out at roostrealestateco.com. Laci, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Chris.
There we have it. Thanks for listening in. If you want to continue the conversation, go to www.landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. That's the Landlord Profitability Playbook Podcast.com, where we have additional information about this podcast, archived episodes, and an option you can select to be a guest on the show. We'll be back next time with another episode of the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast.